Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to the final part of this viewer-requested video series where I've been sharing the meanings that I use when I work with Kipper cards. So if you happen to be just joining me for the series, I'd like to give you a little bit of background as to the inspiration for the series. So one of my viewers, her name is Carolyn, after seeing the video series where I talked about the meanings that I use when I work with Lenormand cards, she emailed me one day asking me if I would do a similar video series, only this time focusing on Kipper cards. And she went one step further in her request, asking if I would work with a particular deck. So the deck that Carolyn has been wanting me to use for this video series is the Siècle Kipper cards, and they are by Ciro Marchetti, and they are published by US Game Systems Incorporated. So the format for the series has been, we've been looking at 6 cards at a time. So we have now looked at the first 30 cards in the deck, and in this wrap-up installment, we're going to be taking a look at the final 6 cards in the deck. So we're going to be starting with card 31, which is Bad Health, and we're going to round things up with the last card, which is Distant Horizons. So now that I've talked about the inspiration for the series, I've talked about the format of the series, and I talked about the deck that's assisting me throughout the series, let's now jump in and take a look at the remaining 6 cards, starting with card 31, Bad Health. And here we are with card 31 in the deck, and card 31 is Bad Health. In traditional Kipper cartomancy, this card is also known as Short Illness. And typically, bad health can represent a minor illness. So you can think of things like a cold, a common cold, when this card comes up. For me, my chief meaning for bad health is that it comes up when there's a need for a rest, to take a break, a timeout, or even a nap. For me, bad health typically can represent some form of recovery. Now, because there's a man lying in a bed in the image on the card, this is known as the bed card, and so it can imply sex and sexual activity. And because there's a nurse in the image on the card, for me, bad health can also represent a checkup, a prescription, or some other form of treatment. Now, again, playing on the idea that there's a man lying in a bed, I tend to think of this as retiring for the evening. That is one way of saying I'm going to bed, is that you're retiring for the evening. And playing on that idea, I tend to look at bad health as retirement, because that is a form of a break from one's work and working life. So bad health for me can represent retirement. So summing up, bad health, also known as short illness, can represent illness, a need for rest, to take a break, or some form of recovery. And so now let's move on to card 32 in the deck. And here we are with card 32 in the deck, and card 32 is Despair. In traditional Kipper cartomancy, this card is also known as Grief and Adversity. And playing on the grief aspect of the card, despair can represent grieving, weeping, or getting some kind of grief. This is a very challenging card, and it could represent severe stress. And again, that's severe stress from the adversities one is facing. Now, playing on the image in the card, there is a man with his hand raised to his head. So for me, despair can represent issues with the head, and I tend to think of things like headaches and migraines. And this is a personal thing for me because I personally experience headaches and migraines. Now, playing on the severe stress aspect of the card, despair can also represent worries. And I mentioned this before with the name being grief and adversity traditionally. So despair can represent adversity and obstacles. From an emotional standpoint, when despair comes up, one can be experiencing frustration, anger, and possibly jealousy with regard to the situation being looked at in the cards. So summing up, despair is a challenging card, and typically when it appears, it can represent grieving, getting grief, being severely stressed, being worried, and facing adversities and obstacles. And so now let's move on to card 33 in the deck. And now we're at card 33 in the deck, and card 33 is concern. I also know this card can be named either murky thoughts or gloomy thoughts. And like despair, the card before it, this is a challenging card. And I tend to liken this card to clouds in Lenormand. And with that in mind, I tend to read concern as confusion, uncertainty, and doubt. Concern can represent negativity and pessimism, or a pessimistic attitude. For me, this card can also represent an inability to focus or concentrate. And concern can also represent depression if you go with the negativity and pessimism or pessimistic attitude aspect of the card. And with that, it can also represent a loss of hope. One thing, and this is personal to me, that concern can represent is this idea of angst. And so for me, personally speaking, one of my greatest challenges to work through in life is this sense of existential angst. So I tend to look at that when concern comes up. So summing up, concern can represent confusion, uncertainty, doubt, negativity, and pessimism. And so now let's turn our attention to card 34 in the deck. And now we're at card 34 in the deck, and card 34 is occupation. And as you probably can guess by its name, occupation is the work card in the deck. And the types of work implied with occupation is working with your hands. I tend to look at this as handiwork or manual and or physical labor. Now we have a seamstress on the card, sewing, and so this card can represent one's craft, trade, or skill. This for me can be a self-employment card. So along with self-employment, it can also represent freelancing or do-it-yourselfing, DIY. And again, playing on the image with the woman sewing, this card can represent actual sewing, being a seamstress or a tailor. That's in the literal sense. In the more metaphorical sense, this card can represent sewing something up, mending something, or some kind of alteration. Now, keeping with the doing something with your hands aspect of the card, this card can also represent a hobby, a sport, or some kind of vocation. I tend to look at occupation as also a mental activity card. And when it comes up, it can be a call for attention to detail. And then the last thing that I want to say about occupation is that this can represent handcrafts and the arts. So summing up, occupation is the work or job card. And so as such, it represents all forms of work, but specifically working with one's hands or manual and physical labor. And so now let's move on to card 35 in the deck. And now we're at card 35 in the deck, and card 35 is pathway. In traditional Kipper cartomancy, this card is also known as a long road or a long way. And literally, pathway can represent a path, a road or street, a walkway, a track, or a trail. Typically, this card can suggest a long road, and as such, it can represent things like a marathon or a triathlon. And that plays into distance, which is another one of my meanings for this card. It represents like going the distance, playing on the idea of marathons and triathlons. It's about going the distance. But it can also represent something that is going to go on for a long time. And with the long time aspect of the card, this card is also known as 2 years patience. And that can imply waiting or a waiting period. And the last thing that I want to say about pathway is that it is a timing card, and it can typically represent a timing period of 1 to 2 years. So summing up, pathway can represent a path, a road, it can represent a long road, and it can imply a long way to go. And so now let's turn our attention to not only the final card in this segment, but the final card in the Kipper deck system, card 36. And here we are with card 36, which is the final card in the Kipper deck system. And card 36 is distant horizons. In traditional Kipper cartomancy, this card is also known as Hope, Big Water. And playing on the hope aspect of the card, this card can represent hopes and dreams. And along those lines, I tend to look at distant horizons as a wish card, so I tend to think of it as wish fulfillment. Now, playing on the big water aspect of the card, this card can represent bodies of water. So some examples would be like the sea, the ocean, lakes, ponds, things of that nature. And playing with the bodies of water aspect of the card, this card can represent things like being overseas. And with that, you can think about foreign people and foreign places with this card. Distant horizons can be a call to open one's mind. So I tend to look at this as opening your mind and developing new views, new ways of looking at things. And I compare this card to Cross in Lenormand in this respect. Cross for me is a card that can represent spirituality, and that's how I look at distant horizons. I look at it as a spirituality card. And not just spirituality, but also philosophy. If you go with the idea about developing a new view and opening your mind, that could be more of a philosophical approach. And playing on the spiritual aspect of the card, distant horizons can represent visions and fantasies for me. And bringing it back to the water aspect of the card, this card can also represent liquids. So you can think of things like drinks, beverages, alcohol, and then bringing the spirituality aspect back in. There are some types of alcohol that are known as spirits. So that's just another way of reinforcing the possible spiritual angle of the card. Now, keeping with the philosophical approach and the developing new views, distant horizons can also represent being on a new adventure. And this card, bringing back the spiritual aspect of it, can represent things like intuition and psychic ability, but also things that are of a metaphysical or esoteric nature or quality. And then the last thing that I want to say about distant horizons is that this is a timing card, and it represents the season of summer. So wrapping up, distant horizons can represent hopes and dreams, and as a wish card, it could represent wishes coming true or being fulfilled. And there you have it. We've now looked at every single card in the Kipper card deck system, and that brings this video series to a close. So as I close, I'm James Himm Mitchell, and I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me throughout this video series, and I'd like to give a special shout out to Carolyn for giving me the inspiration. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and take care.